I walked into my own kitchen after a long day and saw a second refrigerator standing beside mine. Before I could even ask why it was there, my daughter-in-law looked at me and said coldly, "That fridge is mine. If you want food, buy your own." In that moment, something inside me cracked, not because of the refrigerator, but because I suddenly realized I had become a stranger in the house I spent decades building. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I would accept the humiliation. What they did not know was that I had already begun preparing a surprise that would change everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we are truly grateful to have you here. If you have not already, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will capture your attention from beginning to end. Let us begin. My name is Margaret Carter. I am 68 years old, and I have lived almost my entire life in Portland, Oregon, United States. For 35 years, I worked as a high school history teacher in a public school not far from the Willamette River. It was never a glamorous job, and it certainly did not make me wealthy, but it gave me something far more important than money. It gave me purpose, routine, and the quiet satisfaction of believing that I was helping young people understand the world they lived in. There was a time when my life felt steady and predictable. My husband, Daniel Carter Sr., worked as an electrician, and together we built a modest but comfortable life. We were not rich, but we had enough. We had laughter at the dinner table, weekend trips to the farmer's market, and long summer evenings sitting on the porch of our small wooden house in the Selwood Moreland neighborhood of Portland. Everything changed when Daniel died. He suffered a sudden heart attack one autumn evening when our son Ethan was only 12 years old. One moment we were planning dinner, and the next moment I was standing in a hospital hallway trying to understand how my entire world had collapsed in a single night. From that day forward, I became both mother and father to Ethan. The years that followed were not easy. A teacher's salary does not stretch very far when you are raising a child alone and paying a mortgage. I took every extra responsibility the school offered. I taught summer courses. I supervised after-school programs. I spent evenings tutoring students who needed help preparing for college entrance exams. Many nights I stayed up long after Ethan had gone to bed, grading papers at the kitchen table under the yellow light above the stove. I remember falling asleep with stacks of essays beside me and waking up early enough to cook breakfast before driving Ethan to school. But slowly, year after year, those sacrifices began to build something solid. Our house was never large, but it was ours. It stood on a quiet street lined with tall trees that turned golden every autumn. The front porch had a small wooden swing that Daniel had installed himself before he died. Sometimes I would sit there in the evenings, listening to the distant sound of traffic and reminding myself that no matter how difficult life became, we still had a place to call home. That house held every memory of Ethan growing up. It was where he learned to ride his bicycle in the driveway while I ran behind him, afraid he would fall. It was where we decorated the Christmas tree each year, even when money was tight. It was where I sat beside his bed during the nights when storms frightened him after his father passed away. Ethan was a sensitive child. Losing his father changed him in ways I could see even then. He became quieter, more thoughtful, and sometimes unsure of himself. I tried to give him all the encouragement I could. I told him that life was not about being perfect, but about standing up again when things knocked you down. Years passed, and Ethan eventually grew into a young man. When he told me he had met someone special named Vanessa, I remember feeling both excitement and a quiet sense of relief. I believed he had finally found happiness. When they married, I truly hoped our family was beginning a new chapter. When Ethan later asked if he and Vanessa could move into my house for a while, because money had become tight, I did not hesitate for even a second. After all those years of raising him alone, opening my door to my son felt like the most natural decision in the world. What I did not realize then was that sometimes the people we love the most can change the meaning of the very home we built for them. If you are still watching and this moment made you curious about what really happened next, comment number 1 below so I know you are here with me. What started with one cold sentence in my own kitchen was only the beginning. Now, let us move on to chapter 2. Several months passed after Ethan and Vanessa moved into my house, and at first I truly believed everything was working out well. I tried very hard to make their transition comfortable. I cleared half the pantry shelves so Vanessa could organize groceries the way she liked. I moved some of my old dishes into storage to make room for the ones she brought from their apartment. I even adjusted my morning routine so they could sleep later without the sound of my coffee grinder waking them. In the beginning, those changes felt like normal adjustments when family members start living together. Vanessa seemed particular about how things were arranged, especially in the kitchen. She reorganized the cabinets within the first week, moving plates, glasses, and cooking tools to different shelves. It was strange opening drawers and not finding things where they had been for years, but I told myself it was not important. What mattered was that my son and his wife had a place to stay while they got back on their feet. Still, little things began to feel different over time. Vanessa spoke quickly and confidently about the house, as if it were already partly hers. She talked about future renovations and how the kitchen layout could be modernized. Ethan usually stayed quiet during those conversations. When I asked him about work or their plans to move out eventually, he often changed the subject. At first, I told myself I was imagining the tension. Then one quiet afternoon, everything shifted. I had spent the day visiting an old colleague across town. We had coffee, talked about retirement, and laughed about students we both remembered from years ago. It was the kind of afternoon that made me grateful for the slower pace of life after decades of teaching. When I returned home and stepped into the kitchen, something immediately caught my attention. Standing beside my refrigerator was another one. The new appliance was large and made of polished stainless steel that reflected the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. It looked modern and expensive, the kind of refrigerator you might see in a luxury home magazine. I stopped in the doorway, trying to understand what I was seeing. My refrigerator had been working perfectly for years. There had been no reason to replace it. Vanessa walked into the kitchen just then. She looked calm, almost pleased with herself, and leaned casually against the counter. "That refrigerator is mine," she said. "From now on, you should buy your own food." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. I walked slowly to my old refrigerator and opened the door. Inside, nearly every item had a small adhesive label attached to it. The labels were written in thick black marker, and each one carried the same name, Vanessa. The milk carton had her name. The cheese slices had her name. Even the bag of tomatoes I had bought the day before carried the same neat label. I reached for the jar of strawberry jam I had been buying for years and saw another small sticker attached to the glass, Vanessa. Ethan appeared in the doorway behind her. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something that would make this moment feel like a misunderstanding. Instead, he shrugged slightly and spoke in a calm voice. "Maybe it just helps keep things organized, Mom." I closed the refrigerator door slowly. The kitchen felt different now, as if the walls had quietly shifted while I was gone. Those small paper labels were not really about groceries. They were about ownership. And for the first time since Ethan and Vanessa moved into my home, I felt like a stranger standing in my own kitchen. If you are still watching and beginning to see how deep this situation was getting, comment number 2 below to let me know you are following the story. Because what I discovered next made that refrigerator look like the smallest problem in the house. Now, let us continue to Chapter 3. In the days after the refrigerator incident, the house did not explode into arguments or dramatic confrontations. Instead, something quieter happened. The atmosphere changed. At first, I tried to pretend nothing had really happened. I continued with my normal routine, waking early in the morning, making coffee, and sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper. For decades, that kitchen had been the heart of my home, the place where Ethan and I shared breakfast before school and where I graded papers late into the night. Now it felt different. The second refrigerator stood beside mine like an uninvited guest who had decided to stay permanently. Its shiny stainless steel door reflected the light from the window in a way that made the entire room look unfamiliar. The labels inside my refrigerator remained exactly where Vanessa had placed them. For the first few days, I avoided touching anything with her name on it. I found myself buying small groceries for myself and keeping them in a separate corner of the refrigerator, simply to avoid conflict. I hated the feeling. It was not about the food. It was the quiet understanding that I had begun adjusting my behavior in a house that I had spent 40 years paying for. Then the labels began spreading. One morning, I opened the pantry and noticed a small piece of tape on the shelf where the olive oil and cooking vinegar were stored. Vanessa's name was written neatly in black marker. Later that afternoon, I saw another label attached to a plastic container of coffee beans. The next day, there was one on the drawer where the kitchen towels were kept. Each label was small and tidy, almost polite, but together they created invisible boundaries. Soon, the kitchen felt like a map of territories. Some areas were clearly marked as Vanessa's space, while others remained unmarked simply because she had not reached them yet. I never confronted her about it. Instead, I moved through the room more carefully, as if I were a visitor in someone else's house. The realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. One evening, I walked into the living room and noticed Vanessa sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. Papers were spread around her, and several colorful charts were displayed on the computer screen. Ethan stood beside her, leaning over the table. They were talking quietly, but the house was so silent that I could hear parts of their conversation from the hallway. Vanessa was discussing property values. She mentioned that houses in the Selwood Moreland neighborhood had increased significantly in price during the past few years. According to the numbers on her screen, homes on our street were now selling for nearly $450,000. Her voice sounded analytical, almost excited. Ethan did not say much in response. He mostly listened while she pointed to figures and graphs. I stood in the hallway pretending to look at a picture on the wall, but my attention remained on their conversation. For me, the house had never been about money. It was where Ethan took his first steps in the living room. It was where we spent quiet winter evenings watching snow fall through the window. It was the place that held every memory of our family. But listening to Vanessa speak, I realized she saw the house very differently. To her, it was an opportunity. Later that night, I returned to the kitchen for a glass of water. The room was dark, except for the soft light above the sink. The two refrigerators stood side by side in the quiet. As I reached for a cabinet, I noticed another label I had not seen before placed neatly on the wooden door. Vanessa. For the first time, a thought settled heavily in my mind. Maybe the labels were never really about food or organization. Maybe they were the beginning of something much bigger. If you are still here and wondering how someone could be treated this way in their own home, comment number 3 below, so I know you are still with me. The truth I uncovered next changed everything I thought I knew. Let us move on to Chapter 4. The conversation I overheard about property values refused to leave my mind. Vanessa had spoken about houses in the Selwood Moreland neighborhood with the excitement of someone studying an investment opportunity rather than living in a family home. I tried to convince myself it meant nothing. People talk about real estate all the time, especially in a city like Portland, where housing prices seem to climb every year. Still, something about the way she said it lingered with me. A few mornings later, I decided to organize some paperwork in my small study at the back of the house. It was a habit I had developed during my teaching years. I always believed that keeping financial records neat and labeled prevented unnecessary problems later. The study was a quiet room with a wooden desk, 2 bookshelves, and a filing cabinet that held decades of documents. Tax returns, school employment records, and the mortgage papers from the years when I was still paying for the house were all stored there. I pulled open the filing drawer and began sorting through the folders. Most of the documents were routine: bank statements, insurance notices, and utility bills. Nothing unusual appeared at first. Then I noticed an envelope from a bank I did not immediately recognize. The letter looked official. The address printed on the envelope matched my house exactly. I assumed it might be a promotional offer or some type of refinancing advertisement that banks sometimes send to homeowners. I opened it casually. Inside was a multi-page document filled with legal language and financial details. At first glance, I assumed it had been sent by mistake, but when I looked more carefully at the heading, I realized it was not an advertisement. It was a loan notification. The document stated that a mortgage loan had recently been approved using my property as collateral. My first reaction was confusion. I had paid off the mortgage on my house almost 10 years earlier. There should have been no active loans connected to it anymore. I continued reading. The borrower listed on the document was Ethan Carter. For a moment, I felt relieved. Perhaps Ethan had applied for a personal loan to help stabilize his finances. That would not have been unusual. Then I reached the section describing the property attached to the loan. The address listed was my home. My hands suddenly felt cold. I turned the page and found a copy of the loan agreement included in the paperwork. At the bottom of the document was a signature giving permission for the property to be used as collateral. The signature was supposed to be mine. At first glance, it looked similar. The letters formed the same general shape as my name, but I had signed my name thousands of times during my career as a teacher. I knew exactly how my handwriting curved and connected. This was not my signature. I read the page again slowly, hoping I had misunderstood something. But the meaning of the document remained the same. Someone had authorized a mortgage loan using my house as security. Someone had signed my name without my permission. I sat back in my chair and stared at the paper in silence. The house around me felt strangely quiet. From the study window, I could see the small backyard where Ethan used to play when he was a child. The apple tree near the fence was just beginning to bloom. For 40 years, I had worked to protect that home. Suddenly, the conversation I overheard earlier returned to my mind. Vanessa speaking about rising property values, charts on her computer screen, numbers and calculations. Slowly, a terrible possibility began to form in my thoughts. Maybe the refrigerator and the labels had never been about food at all. Maybe they had been the beginning of something far more serious. If you are still watching and feel that something bigger is about to explode, comment number 4 below so I know you are still on this journey. Because the next moment was the turning point where everything finally came into the open. Now, let us continue to Chapter 5. I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in my study with the loan documents spread across my desk. I read every page slowly, sometimes more than once, hoping I would eventually discover some small detail that proved everything was a misunderstanding. But every paragraph told the same story. A mortgage loan had been approved using my house as collateral. The more I read, the more I realized the document was not a simple mistake. It contained legal descriptions of the property, the loan amount, and the date the agreement had been finalized. The paperwork looked official, detailed, and carefully prepared. And at the bottom of the authorization page was a signature that was supposed to belong to me, except it did not. I had signed my name on countless school forms, report cards, and legal documents over the course of my career. The way my handwriting curved was as familiar to me as the sound of my own voice. This signature imitated the shape of my name, but it lacked the natural rhythm of how I wrote it. Someone had copied my signature. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm the tight feeling building in my chest. The last thing I wanted to do was rush into a confrontation without understanding exactly what had happened. One name kept repeating itself in my thoughts: Robert Hayes. Robert had been our family lawyer for years. After my husband died, he helped me update my will and organize several property documents. He had always been patient and careful with details, which was exactly what I needed now. I called his office that afternoon. I found some paperwork connected to my house, I explained quietly. Something about a mortgage loan. I do not remember signing anything like this. Robert asked me to bring the documents to his office the following morning. The next day, I drove downtown to meet him. His office building stood several blocks from the Portland courthouse, an older brick structure with tall windows and quiet hallways. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. When Robert entered the conference room, he greeted me warmly but quickly noticed the seriousness in my expression. I handed him the folder without saying much. He read through the documents carefully, turning each page slowly. His face remained calm, but the longer he studied the papers, the more focused his expression became. Finally, he set the documents down on the table. "This loan appears to be legitimate," he said in a measured tone. "The bank processed it through standard channels." My stomach tightened. "But I never signed it," I replied. Robert nodded thoughtfully and examined the signature again. "If the signature is not yours," he said, "then this could involve fraud." The word hung in the air between us. He began checking several details in the paperwork, including the destination of the loan funds. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "The money has already been transferred," he explained. "It went into an investment account connected to a real estate company." I stared at him, trying to understand. "What company?" I asked. Robert looked down at the documents again. "It appears to be administered under the name Vanessa Carter." For a moment, the room felt strangely quiet. I thought about the charts on Vanessa's laptop and the way she had spoken about property values in our neighborhood. Suddenly, those conversations made a terrible kind of sense. Robert spoke again, carefully. "If someone used your property without authorization, we will need to gather clear evidence before confronting anyone." I left his office later that afternoon with the documents back in my folder. When I returned home, the kitchen was empty. The two refrigerators stood side by side beneath the soft evening light. The labels still covered the shelves inside my refrigerator. But now I understood something I had not fully seen before. Those labels were never about organization. They were the first step in taking something much bigger. For several days after my meeting with Robert Hayes, I said nothing to Ethan or Vanessa about the documents I had discovered. Life inside the house continued as if nothing had changed. Vanessa still worked on her laptop for hours at the dining table, occasionally reviewing spreadsheets and charts. Ethan came and went quietly, rarely asking questions about what she was doing. The kitchen remained divided by those small paper labels. Every morning I walked past them while making my coffee. Each label felt less like a minor irritation and more like a quiet declaration of control. But now I understood something Vanessa did not realize. I knew the truth. Robert and I spoke again 2 days after our first meeting. He suggested that silence might not be the best strategy forever. If Vanessa believed the loan arrangement was secure, she would continue moving forward with her plans. He recommended a direct confrontation, but one that remained calm and organized rather than emotional. That advice, stayed with me. I decided the best place for the truth to surface would be at the dinner table. The following Saturday, I invited Ethan and Vanessa to join me for a family meal. I also invited Vanessa's parents, explaining that I wanted to discuss something important about the future of the family. Vanessa seemed pleased by the invitation. I could see it in the confident way she moved through the house that afternoon. She likely believed I was finally accepting her influence in the household. I spent most of the day cooking. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a homemade apple pie filled the kitchen with familiar smells. For a few hours, the house almost felt like it used to years ago when Ethan was younger and dinner meant laughter rather than quiet tension. By early evening, everyone had arrived. Vanessa's parents sat comfortably at the table, and the conversation started politely enough. We spoke about the weather, about local events in Portland, and about small updates in everyone's lives. Vanessa appeared relaxed, occasionally checking her phone and smiling confidently as if she already knew how the evening would unfold. Dinner ended quietly. When the plates were cleared away, I walked to the side table and picked up the envelope I had prepared earlier. I returned to the dining table and placed it gently in front of me. "I found something concerning about my house," I said calmly. The room fell silent. I opened the envelope and slid several copies of the mortgage documents across the table so everyone could see them. The papers clearly described the loan, the property used as collateral, and the authorization signature that was supposed to belong to me. Vanessa's expression changed instantly. She began speaking quickly, insisting the situation had been misunderstood and explaining that the loan was connected to a business opportunity that would benefit everyone in the long run. Before the conversation could spiral into confusion, the front door opened. Robert Hayes entered the dining room moments later. He introduced himself as my attorney and calmly confirmed that the documents appeared to involve an unauthorized mortgage agreement connected to my property. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Ethan looked from the documents to Vanessa, his face pale as the implications became clear. Vanessa tried to defend the arrangement, describing it as an investment designed to increase the family's financial security. But Robert's explanation was simple and direct. Using someone's property as collateral without their consent could carry serious legal consequences. I remained seated quietly while the tension spread across the room. For weeks, I had wondered how this moment would feel. Now that it had arrived, I realized something surprising. I was no longer afraid. If you are still with me and want to see how this confrontation truly unfolds, comment number 6 below, so I know you are still watching. What happened next forced everyone in that house to face the consequences of their choices. Let us move on to Chapter 7. The moment Robert finished explaining the legal situation, the entire dining room seemed to fall into a strange, heavy silence. The plates had already been cleared from the table, but the air still carried the faint smell of roasted chicken and apple pie. It felt almost surreal that only a few minutes earlier we had been sharing what looked like a normal family dinner. Vanessa was the first person to react. Her face tightened with disbelief, and she began speaking quickly, her voice sharp and defensive. She insisted that everything had been misunderstood and that the mortgage loan was simply part of a financial plan she believed would help the family in the long run. According to her explanation, the rising property values in Portland created opportunities for smart investment. She argued that she had been thinking about everyone's future, not trying to harm anyone. But her words sounded different now that the documents were sitting openly on the table. Robert remained calm while she spoke. His tone never changed, and he repeated the same basic fact. Using property as collateral without the owner's clear authorization could lead to serious legal consequences. The words seemed to settle slowly into the room. Vanessa's parents looked confused and uncomfortable. They had arrived expecting an ordinary family dinner, not a legal discussion involving mortgage fraud. I could see them exchanging uncertain glances as they tried to understand how the situation had become so serious. Ethan had not said anything since Robert entered the room. He sat quietly in his chair with the documents in front of him, reading each page slowly. His eyes moved across the lines of legal language as if he were trying to absorb every detail. For several minutes, he said nothing at all. I watched him carefully. He looked older in that moment, as if the weight of the situation had suddenly forced him to see things he had not fully considered before. His expression carried confusion, frustration, and something deeper that I could not immediately identify. Finally, he lifted his head and looked toward Vanessa. The question he asked her was quiet, but the meaning behind it filled the room with tension. He wanted to know whether she had understood that the loan required my authorization before it could be approved. Vanessa hesitated before answering. That hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer to everyone sitting at the table. In that pause, Ethan seemed to realize something important. The certainty that had once defined Vanessa's confidence was beginning to crack. Instead of responding directly to his question, Vanessa began speaking again about investment opportunities and financial growth. She described the loan as a temporary step toward building a more comfortable future for everyone involved. But the explanation no longer carried the same authority. The documents remained on the table between us. I spoke only once during that exchange. I reminded everyone that the house represented 40 years of work and sacrifice. It was the place where I raised my son and the one thing in my life that I had protected through every difficult year. My voice stayed calm, but my decision was clear. Vanessa's frustration quickly turned into anger. She pushed her chair back from the table and stood abruptly, her expression hard and defensive. Without waiting for the conversation to continue, she walked toward the front door. Her parents followed shortly afterward, clearly unsettled by what they had just witnessed. Within minutes, the house became quiet again. Ethan remained seated at the dining table long after everyone else had left. The documents were still spread out before him. I stood across the room watching my son carefully. For the first time since this situation began, it felt as though he was finally seeing the truth that had been hidden in front of him. After Vanessa and her parents left the house, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. The front door had barely finished closing when the entire house seemed to settle into a strange stillness. Outside, the evening air in Portland had grown cool, and the faint sound of traffic drifted through the open window near the dining room. Ethan remained seated at the table. The mortgage documents were still spread across the wood surface in front of him. He did not move them or fold them away. Instead, he studied the pages slowly, reading certain sections more than once, as if trying to fully understand what they meant. I stayed in the kitchen doorway for a while, watching him quietly. For years, I had watched my son face small problems in life, but this moment felt different. This was not about a missed bill or a simple misunderstanding. It was about responsibility, trust, and the consequences of decisions that could affect far more than one person. Eventually, Ethan leaned back in his chair and ran his hand across his forehead. He asked how the loan could even exist if the house legally belonged to me. His voice carried confusion rather than anger. The tension that had filled the room earlier had now been replaced with something quieter and more thoughtful. I walked to the table and sat down across from him. There was something I had never told him. 2 years earlier, after retiring from teaching, I had spent time organizing my financial records. Retirement had made me realize how quickly circumstances could change, and I wanted to ensure that the house I had worked so hard to keep would always remain secure. During that process, I met with Robert Hayes several times. Together, we created a family trust. The house had been transferred into that trust as part of my long-term planning. The legal structure meant the property could not be sold, transferred, or used as collateral without my direct authorization. The trust existed quietly in the background of my financial records, protecting the house in ways that most people would never notice. I had never mentioned it to Ethan. At the time, I did not want him to feel as if I distrusted him or believed he might make poor decisions. It simply seemed like the responsible step for someone entering retirement. When I explained this to him, Ethan looked down at the documents again. The realization appeared slowly in his expression. The mortgage loan might exist on paper, but it could not legally claim the house itself. The trust protected the property in ways Vanessa had clearly not anticipated. Relief passed across Ethan's face, but it was followed quickly by something else: embarrassment. He understood that his involvement in the loan had placed the entire household in danger, even if the trust prevented the worst outcome. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan gathered the papers and stacked them neatly together. I could see that he was thinking carefully about everything that had happened during the past few weeks. After he left the table, I remained in the kitchen alone. The two refrigerators still stood side by side under the dim light above the counter. Small labels were still attached to shelves and containers throughout the room. For the first time since they appeared, they no longer felt threatening. They felt temporary. I reached toward the cabinet door where one label remained and peeled it away slowly. Then I dropped it into the trash. If you are still here and want to see how this story finally ends, comment number 8 below to let me know you made it this far. Because the final part of this journey revealed something none of us expected. Now let us move toward the ending of the story. Several weeks passed after the night of the confrontation. The house slowly returned to a rhythm that felt familiar again, though not exactly the same as before. Silence no longer felt tense or uncomfortable. Instead, it carried the quiet steadiness that had once defined my life before everything became complicated. Vanessa never returned to the house after that evening. At first, I expected another argument or some attempt to defend the situation she had created, but none came. Within a few days, Ethan told me that she had moved back to her parents' home on the other side of Portland. The separation was not dramatic. It felt more like the quiet end of something that had already begun to fall apart long before the dinner table confrontation. Without Vanessa in the house, the atmosphere changed quickly. The labels that once covered the kitchen cabinets disappeared one by one. I removed some of them myself, while others Ethan quietly peeled away without saying anything. Soon the kitchen began to look the way it had for years before those small pieces of tape appeared. But the most noticeable change was in Ethan. For the first week after Vanessa left, he seemed lost in thought. I often saw him sitting at the table with his laptop open, reviewing job listings or studying financial statements connected to the loan. His expression carried a seriousness I had not seen in him for a long time. He no longer avoided difficult conversations. Instead, he began asking questions about the paperwork, the bank, and the steps required to correct the financial situation he had helped create. Even though the family trust protected the house from the mortgage claim, Ethan insisted that the loan money still represented a responsibility he could not ignore. Gradually, he began taking practical steps. He updated his resume and applied for several positions across Portland. After a few interviews, he accepted a job at a building supply company near the industrial district along the river. It was not the type of work he once imagined for himself, but he approached it with a quiet determination that surprised me. One evening, he placed an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was the first payment he intended to make toward the loan balance. The amount was modest, but the gesture carried meaning far beyond the number written on the check. Ethan explained that paying the debt himself was the only way he could rebuild his sense of responsibility. Not long after that, he began searching for an apartment. At first, the idea of him leaving the house felt painful. For many years, I had believed my role as a parent was to protect him from every difficulty life placed in his path. but watching him prepare to stand on his own changed my perspective. The afternoon he moved out was quiet and simple. We loaded several boxes into the back of his car and spoke only occasionally while carrying furniture to the driveway. When he finally drove away, I stood on the porch watching the car disappear down the street. For the first time in a long while, the house behind me felt calm again. Several months passed after Ethan moved into his apartment, and life slowly returned to a rhythm I had not felt in a long time. The house was quiet again, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet rather than the tense silence that had filled the rooms during those difficult weeks. The kitchen looked like my kitchen once more. The labels that had once covered the shelves were gone, and the second refrigerator had disappeared shortly after Vanessa left the house. I moved through this space freely again, opening cabinets and preparing meals without the strange feeling that I was trespassing in my own home. Each morning, I returned to the simple routines that had always brought me comfort. I made coffee and sat near the window that faced the backyard. The apple tree behind the fence had begun to grow new leaves again, marking the slow arrival of another season in Portland. Retirement had always meant quiet mornings and unhurried afternoons to me. For a while, I thought that sense of calm had been lost forever, but now it seemed to be returning little by little. Ethan began visiting regularly on Sundays. Those visits were very different from the tense evenings we once shared under the same roof. Now he arrived with a calm attitude and a sense of purpose that had not been present before. He talked about his work at the building supply company and the responsibilities he had taken on there. The job was not glamorous, but it had given him something important: structure. Each time he visited, he brought a small envelope containing another payment toward the loan he had helped create. The family trust meant the house itself had never truly been in danger, but Ethan insisted that the money still represented a mistake he needed to correct. Watching him take that responsibility quietly filled me with a mixture of pride and humility. For many years, I believed protecting my son meant shielding him from every possible hardship. Now I understood that growth sometimes requires facing the consequences of our decisions. I occasionally heard small pieces of news about Vanessa through mutual acquaintances. She eventually moved away from Portland, searching for opportunities somewhere else. I never felt the need to follow those details closely. Some chapters of life close naturally. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees outside, I stood in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner, and the familiar smell of cooking filled the room. For a long moment, I simply stood there, looking around the house I had spent decades building and protecting. I realized that what mattered most was never the walls or the roof. It was the strength to defend what those walls represented. And in the quiet of that evening, I knew I had finally found the peace I earned. Sometimes the hardest lessons in life arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments that slowly reveal their meaning over time. A home is more than walls, furniture, or the things stored in a refrigerator. It is built from years of work, sacrifice, patience, and love. When those foundations are tested, people discover something important about themselves. Respect, dignity, and self-worth are not given by others. They are protected by the choices we make when life becomes difficult. True strength is not about anger or revenge. It is about knowing when to stand firm, when to protect what you have built, and when to allow others the chance to learn from their own paths. In the end, peace does not come from winning arguments. It comes from holding on to your values while still leaving space for growth, forgiveness, and understanding. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more meaningful stories.